On 9th of April 2018, the television programme Springtime on the Farm made its debut on Channel 5, celebrating the joys of the British countryside during springtime. It introduced us to the Nicholson family, the farmers who live and work at Cannon Hall Farm near Barnsley in South Yorkshire. Roger Nicholson heads up the family and comes from a farming dynasty that can be traced back to the 1600s. He has lived at Cannon Hall Farm ever since his father brought the 126-acre property at auction in 1958. Prior to their big move, the Nicholsons lived in Bank End Farm in the nearby village of Wusbrodale, where several generations of the family worked the land and made their mark in the farming world. The farm was passed down from brother to brother and from father to son, each of them maintaining the land, growing healthy crops, and caring for their animals. Roger's charismatic father, Charlie, was himself a highly respected stockman and made headlines for his prize-winning white bull, whose pedigree name was Fockerby Ringleader. As well as being a fine short-horn specimen, the bull was partial to a drink of beer and would happily swallow a pint after a country show victory, much to the amusement of spectators. The story actually made the local newspaper. Even back then, Charlie Nicholson could recognise the marketing potential of an interesting animal on a local farm. Although they had lived at Bank End Farm since 1798, the family rented most of their land, and what started out as a fairly sizable farm of 250 acres began to shrink as the land was sold off bit by bit because of compulsory purchase orders. Acres of beautiful farmland full of crops were sold off, and developers turned it into a housing estate and a local school. By the end of their time there, only 30 acres of the original plot remained, which, for the Nicholsons, wasn't viable to sustain a family business. A fresh start was needed. Roger was still at school when the family moved to their new home at Cannon Hall Farm, and although he intended to take over the family business one day, fate intervened when Charlie died suddenly of a heart attack in 1959. Soon after Roger, then aged just 16, had to leave school and quickly learn how to make a living as a farmer so he could support himself and his mother, Renee. 3 years later, Roger met his future wife, Cynthia Nicholson, at a young farmers' club dance in Halifax. The story goes that while feisty Cynthia greatly impressed Roger by winning a competition at the dance, she wasn't at all enamoured by his advances, and it took a bit of convincing for her to agree to meet him again. But something must have won her over, and 3 years of courtship later, Roger and Cynthia married in 1965 and moved to the picture-perfect Tower Cottage at Cannon Hall Farm. Their eldest son, Richard, was born in 1966, followed by Robert in 1968, and youngest son, David, 2 years later. It was an idyllic environment for the Nicholson boys to grow up in, surrounded by acres of lush farmland to play in, woods to build their secret dens and streams to catch fish. In the early years, Roger kept a variety of livestock, including dairy cows, pigs, sheep, and some hens. But although he worked as hard as he was able, he struggled to make a living from farming. On the days that he'd take his families off to be sold at market, he never seemed to get the rightful return for his hard graft. Cost of rearing animals to enable him to produce really top-quality meat was never reflected when deals were struck and the hammer came down. And later, as bigger farms became more industrialised and smaller homesteads were effectively squeezed out of the marketplace, the Nicholson family knew that they had to diversify their farm output so that they could keep a roof over their heads. Living within your means is one thing, but when it's year after year of struggle, and others who started out on the same level playing field seem to be getting more and more successful, it's time for a rethink. Not that Roger was ever one to rest on his laurels. He'd focus on expanding a breed, then make strides in a different direction, hoping each time that he would settle on the most successful direction for the farm. For example, when his dairy herd wasn't profitable enough, he started rearing more pigs to see if that was where he'd find better returns. Each time, his efforts would pay off initially, but it was never quite enough for the farm to become really successful, or for life to get any easier. Cannon Hall Farm was once part of the Cannon Hall estate owned by the Spencer Stanhope family, who made their fortune in the iron industry. In the 1950s, the estate was broken up and sold, and the original Georgian country house was later turned into a museum.